So about 2 weeks ago, I sent a text to some comrades and I said, what is our position on Scottish independence? And they probably rolled their eyes and said, oh, here's Caleb again. You know, he's probably wondering what's the next, what's our position on the 6th Congress or the 3rd International, or, you know, is he asking about Albania this time, you know, what's this about? And there's something to be said for that, because that's the point. Until recent weeks ago, the question of Scottish independence was very abstract. It was something that didn't seem very relevant in the ongoing struggle. And a number of communists and socialists in Britain actually oppose it for that reason. They say the question of Scottish independence is a distraction. And they talk about when they would go onto a college campus and be leafleting and saying to students, let's rally against tuition hikes or rally against the war. There's always somebody who says, oh, let's not focus on that. We just need independence. You know, and it's a distraction. It makes sense that some revolutionary forces might be hostile to it on that basis. And as a party in the USA, we don't feel a need to go around opposing or supporting Scottish independence. This is something for the Scottish working class to decide. However, as a revolutionary party and as Marxists who are constantly scientifically analyzing the world, we can't ignore what happened yesterday. Yesterday, nearly half the voters cast their ballot for independence. 97% of the population was registered to vote. The Yes campaign, urging independence, was staffed mainly by young people, college students, unemployed youth, and they packed university campuses in huge meetings, standing room only, demanding independence. St. George Square in Glasgow was basically turned into a center, with every day having huge rallies for independence. And as it became clear that there was a really good chance that this independence vote may pass, the ruling class, the capitalists, the billionaires, the people who actually rule the world suddenly got very, very nervous. British Prime Minister David Cameron even announced on Sunday that Britain wouldn't decide what action they were taking in Iraq about airstrikes in Iraq and Syria until the vote had already taken place. Nick Landon, the head of the Financial Stability Committee of the G20, didn't go to the G20 summit in Austria. Instead, he canceled his trip and went back to Scotland to coordinate the efforts to defeat the independence vote. All three major political parties in Britain, the Labour Party, the Conservative Party, and the Liberal Democratic Party, opposed Scottish independence and spent millions of dollars sending their forces there to urge people to vote no. Former Prime Minister Gordon Brown was in Scotland for almost a month begging people to vote no. U.S. President Barack Obama urged people to vote no. British Petroleum and Shell Oil also urged people to vote no. And something was happening. Despite all of this effort to urge people to vote no, there was this huge, huge push among the people for a yes vote. So something was happening. As Marxists, we have to understand what was going on there. Now, Britain was once the top dog of imperialism. There's not a single day that goes by that in the Middle East or in Africa or in Asia there's not somebody cursing the British Empire and its royal family. Britain rose to prominence as an industrial power with their development of the textile industry. And the cotton that was used in the British textile mills was largely picked by slaves in the U.S. South. And when the Civil War happened, it was the nobles and the big businessmen and the bankers in Britain who were supporting the U.S. South, hoping they could keep the cheap cotton flowing in. The people of India have suffered generations of humiliation and degradation from the British. At one point, India actually had its own textile industry, and it was the British who destroyed it, forcing them to buy their textile from Britain. My ancestors were forced to come to this country because of a man-made famine in Ireland. As a result of conditions set up by British bankers and industrialists, millions of Irish people starved to death. The British Empire established the first Zionist settlements in Palestine. At one point, the majority of Jewish people in the world were socialists and communists, but it was wealthy British bankers who funded the Zionist movement, a racist, colonialist movement, and promoted that, and it helped establish the State of Israel, which has committed all these crimes against the people. The people of the Caribbean have suffered horribly. The people of various Asian countries have also suffered horribly, and if we were to go over all the crimes of the British imperialists, we would be here all night. The way the British imperialists made their oppression work was by dividing the working class at home. They gave so-called skilled workers higher wages and a more comfortable lifestyle. And the British government also had a policy of encouraging working class people in Britain to become settlers, sending them over to colonized areas to be overseers and bosses and cops to kind of enforce British rule. In fact, in Lenin's book Imperialism, he quotes about this. There was a British imperialist who was key in the settlements of Africa, Cecil Rhodes. I know Zimbabwe, before it won its independence, was called Rhodesia after Cecil Rhodes. And Lenin quotes him. He says, Cecil Rhodes, we are informed by an intimate friend and journalist, expressed his imperialist views to him following the terms, I was in the East End of London, this is Cecil Rhodes talking, at a meeting in a working class quarter yesterday, attending a meeting it was a meeting about unemployment. And I listened to the wild speeches that were just a cry for bread, bread, bread. And on my way home, I pondered the scene and became ever more convinced of the importance of imperialism, of buying off the working class, giving them some of the crumbs and dividing it. Now, as Wall Street emerged as the dominant imperialist in the 20th century, British imperialism began to decline. And Wall Street is currently playing the role that Britain once played as the center of the world capitalist economy, exploiting the people of the world. After Britain had been destroyed by Nazi bombs in the Second World War, huge measures were taken to keep British people's loyalty to imperialism. A national health care service was created. Free university education was established. The leading political party was the Labour Party, which claimed, falsely, to be a party of socialism. Huge efforts were made to employ British people and wipe out unemployment, create jobs, and a welfare state, what can be called a welfare state, was created. Now, the bankers didn't give a comfortable lifestyle to some of the people in Britain because they felt like it. They did it because they had to. In the 1920s and 30s, British imperialism had been in crisis, and the British working class had fought back. Britain had been shut down with a general strike in 1926. During the 1930s, the Communist Party of Great Britain had a huge amount of influence in the labor movement. In the hunger marches, workers and miners who were laid off and unemployed in Scotland would march all the way down to London, demanding jobs and wages. In 1936, there was a British Nazi named Oswald Mosley who wanted to hold a parade in support of Hitler in London on a place called Cable Street. And the communists in Britain organized a march, and it was Irish workers, English workers, Scottish workers, Southeast Asian workers, African workers joined together, and they blocked this march. It was called the Battle of Cable Street, and it's celebrated all over the world. Before and during the Second World War, a clear majority of British people held a favorable opinion of the Soviet Union. British workers saw that the King of England had actually been forced to step down because he'd been so sympathetic to the Nazis, and many of the bombs that fell on British workers had been purchased with loans from British banks that had loaned it to the Nazis. One of the most amazing things that the British Communist Party did was it occupied the subways. You know, in London, while the British were being bombed by the Nazis, in the working class areas, the government wasn't providing shelters to people. And so the Communist Party clubs went down into the subways and occupied it, said we need to be here to get protection. And when the police came in to drive them out, they fought them, and they demanded their right to occupy the subways. Now, the welfare state that was created after especially escalated after the Second World War, was devoted to winning British people's loyalty to empire. And in the last 60 years, British people in England, Scotland, and Wales have become accustomed to a comfortable lifestyle with high wages, social programs, free health care, and other benefits. But that's changing. Now, just like in the 1930s, the Western capitalist world is facing an economic crisis. In the name of austerity, British university students now have to pay for their education in many parts of the country. Government workers are being laid off or having their pensions slashed. A bedroom tax has been created, which in some cases cuts the income of low-paid or disabled workers in half. Can you imagine that? You get taxed for having an extra bedroom in your house, and it cuts your income in half. In Britain, there is a huge amount of unemployment among the youth. And the youth who are employed get very low wages and have far less protection on the job than their parents. Sound a little bit familiar? In 2011, there was a huge explosion of youth in Britain who rebelled, breaking into stores. It was a huge episode of social unrest, and there have been massive protests by the unions and on the college campuses. And the movement for Scottish independence is very much part of the resistance to austerity. So let's talk about Scotland now. Scotland is definitely a nation. It has a national heritage. It has a national language which has been suppressed. It has its own distinct religious groups which have developed independently. It has its own unique culture and history. Scotland is a nation, but it is also a nation within the British imperialist homeland. Scottish bankers make super profits exploiting the third world just like English ones do. Scotland is not part of the oppressed world, and it's not a colony of England. The struggle for Scottish independence is not a classic national liberation struggle like in Ireland or Puerto Rico or in Palestine or other countries from the oppressed world that are trying to break free. The overwhelming majority of the billionaires and bankers are opposed to Scottish independence, but not all of them are. There are a number of Scottish capitalists who think that they could get a better deal under independence. One of the big issues in the independence vote was the natural gas and oil resources. Independence would have put control of these resources and the billions of dollars to be made from them up for grabs. It would have taken it out of the hands of BP and Shell, and it would have given other capitalists a chance to move in. However, to the millions of Scottish youth who went out and campaigned for independence, it wasn't about oil, and it wasn't even really about the national question. Scotland is a stronghold for the unions and for the Labour Party. In the last 51 years, never have the Scottish people voted in their majority for the Conservative Party. Scotland is part of a country where workers have lower incomes on average, and they tend to be more liberal, especially on economic issues. University education is no longer free for the majority of British students, but in Scotland they've refused to take it away. Millions of people who voted for independence yesterday were not exactly voting for independence from the United Kingdom. They were voting for independence from the Conservative Party. They were voting to stop the cuts in public education, voting to stop the cuts in the National Health Service, and voting to stop the cuts in the child care programs. They were voting to preserve the jobs of government workers. They were voting to rally, and they were rallying their friends to vote in the millions. I mean, it was a mass movement, and kind of came out of nowhere. They didn't see it coming. They decided that there would be a referendum on independence in 2011, and it was like almost, they assumed they would never pass, but then almost out of nowhere it seemed like there was this huge upsurge of people wanting independence. Now the Scottish National Party and the Scottish Socialist Party, which dominate the local governments in Scotland, called for the immediate nationalisation of certain industries if there had been independence. Now many of the activists in the Scottish independence movement actually pointed out that if Scotland had won its independence, it wouldn't have been real independence. They would have been part of the Commonwealth. They would have still had to recognize the Queen. The military would have remained united, and they would have kept the British pound as their currency. But one of the big grievances of the Scottish people is that the nuclear weapons that are owned by the British military are being stored in Scotland. And they're there even though numerous times the people in Scotland, in their overwhelming majority, we're talking like 90%, have said they don't want those nuclear weapons there. But every time it's up for a vote for them to be moved, it's voted down and the nuclear weapons stay up there. Until a few weeks ago, no one really thought that it would be possible. But then when this movement came in, the bourgeoisie spent billions of dollars to try and urge people to vote no. And now the vote came down. It was a close vote, but it was a vote no. But now there have been more than 10 instances of fraud reported. In one urban area called Dundee, twice while the votes were being counted, the fire alarm went off. And when people got back into the building, all the tables had been moved around. And there's actually a video that's surfaced in another area of a woman, someone videoed a woman vote counting, and she's clearly distorting and she's moving it around. So there's instances of fraud. Now, the young people who have been rallying in St. George Square in Glasgow demanding independence, they haven't given up. But just today, the neo-Nazis, the British National Party, which is an ultra-right-wing party, went to the square in Glasgow and fought with the youth. And there have been scuffles there between the youth that want the Yes campaign, want independence, and these ultra-right-wing Nazi groups. So we have to understand Scottish independence in these terms. Revolutionaries are a lot like dentists. There's a small minority of people that ever since they were kids, they were playing with the doll's teeth and they read all about teeth and were obsessed with teeth. But for most of us, we really don't want anything to do with dentists unless we have to. But you get in that situation where you've got a cavity and it hurts so bad, or that filling fell out and you've got to find a dentist, right? And that's how it is for most people. That's how it is. And we in this room, we represent the vanguard. We're the section of society that's always thinking about revolution. We dream about revolution every night and we work like hell for it every day. But we're a small section of society. But when the rest of society gets into a situation where things just can't get better, and those wages keep just going down, and the oppressive state just keeps coming down on us, all of a sudden they start looking for revolutionaries. The working class, if it really wants to be free, it can't align with any capitalists. It has to be working independently, fighting in its own interest against all the capitalists and all the bankers and all the billionaires. But that's going to be difficult. And the recent explosions that we see in places like Ferguson, Missouri, or the Occupy events of 2011, or what's happening in Scotland is the working class gradually waking up and learning how to fight. So that's what's happening. The capitalist crisis is forcing all kinds of things that never would have been up for discussion onto the table. And this issue of Scottish independence is a real revelation of that. It was the youth, it was the working class, the votes for independence were the strongest in the most working class and oppressed areas with the unemployment. This was a struggle against austerity. The working class is gradually waking up, and so we as a revolutionary party have to be where these explosions come into, these spontaneous explosions of the workers, and we need to point them in a revolutionary direction. So I just want to end, there there was a song that Francis Dostal taught me, a founding member of the party, and it was a song, and one of the verses, and it was in the 1930s, she learned it as a child in the Young Communist League. It's called the United Front Song, and I just wanted to sing one of the verses, and I'll end with that. The worker is the worker, and there is no other road to liberty. For only the working class alone can end wage slavery. When I speak and when we as the party talk, we often find ourselves talking a lot about the 30s, about the 1930s, and making references to that. And it's really eerie, the similarities of the current period and the 1930s, because if you look at, you talk about the 1930s, in response to the capitalist crisis, there was a huge fight back by the working class, and then in response to that, the capitalist bosses fomented fascism, and you saw fascism. You saw the rise of Hitler in Germany, Mussolini in Italy, fascist movements around the world designed to beat back the workers. And what are we seeing now in Britain? I mean, the whole world was shocked when the British National Party, an openly white supremacist group, a whites-only neo-Nazi party, won seats in the British Parliament. And in France, the ultra-right, the far-right fascist groups are also on the march. And in Greece, the Golden Dawn, is on the march. And now in Ukraine, you see how they utilized the ultra-right. And even if you look at what they're doing in Syria, I mean, these Takfiris and Wahhabis are essentially fascists. I mean, that's what they are. They're violent people enforcing and attacking people on the basis of their religion, and they're disgusting. And that seems to be part of the program. But what I find to be a little interesting and different about this period is that we don't have the Soviet Union. Because part of what made the fight back so strong in the 1930s was the existence of the Soviet Union. March 6, 1931, there was a huge demonstration in Union Square, 20,000, so many people. The police told them they couldn't march, and they said, well, you've opened these streets to all the kings and queens of Europe. We're going to march anyway. And they charged and fought the cops all the way down to City Hall. But it was March 6th. It was International Unemployment Day. It was international because the Communist International had called for a day against unemployment all over the world. And those things had happened, and the Soviet Union was there, and while the rest of the world was having a Great Depression, the Soviet Union was booming, and it was industrializing, and all over the world people looked to the Soviet Union as proof that this capitalism didn't need to exist. But we don't have a Soviet Union at this point. There's no alternative there, but yet the fascists are still there. The working class is in motion and starting to fight back. And technology is much more different. The capitalists have got a much bigger apparatus of repression now. They can listen to every phone call, read everything. But in addition to that, the working class, we also can use technology and we can coordinate the resistance. So it's interesting to look back at the period of the 1930s, to look back at the mistakes that were made by revolutionary forces and all of that, but to also think about how it's different, because we're in a situation where capitalism, it's a crisis of overproduction. We always talk about, they work so hard to increase technology to produce so much, and the result is that fewer workers are hired, fewer workers have the ability to buy. People are homeless because there are too many houses, and people are laid off building houses. People are hungry because there's too much food, and so people are laid off in the food industry. It's the problems that capitalism can't solve. And that's the period that we're in. And things like this Scottish independence referendum, things like Occupy Wall Street, things like the explosions in Ferguson, the rising police state and repression, the move toward incarceration, the building up of the prison system. This is all capitalism functioning according to the same laws that we've always studied. And so, when we talk about the 30s, it may seem arbitrary, it may seem like something that's not relevant, but it's extremely relevant. The question is, how is this period different? How can we learn the lessons, and how can we move ahead? So I just wanted to say that.